Lawyers, what is the most ridiculous argument you've heard in court? Lawyer who is not practicing in court, but when I was in college doing my bachelor's degree, criminal law was part of the curriculum. And this included spending a couple of days observing criminal trials, the things you witness. Anyway, at the start of one of these trials, a guy with the greasiest mullet enters the room, thin, tall, disproportionately sized limbs, tattoos all over. I swear the way he sat before the judge, the only thing that was missing was a drink in his hand and a chicken under his arm. Now, this guy chose not to have a lawyer represent him as he's a regular and spends short periods of time in jail or doing community service pretty much every month anyway. Real problem cases, substances, drinking habits, etc. But he still comes across as a really sympathetic dude and has a really entertaining way of telling a story while keeping a straight face and not realizing how funny he is. He knows he's getting fined and a couple of hours of cutting grass as community service to keep our Dutch streets nice and tidy, but tries to win the sympathies of the judge to decrease his sentence. This man's dog was sent to a dog shelter when they found it malnourished a couple of weeks before when they brought him in for dealing. Real sad, but also the reason he's standing trial. The guy was onto something and intoxicated as an Irishman on St. Patrick's Day, while completely out of his mind, decided to get his dog back from the shelter because he really missed his girl. The judge asks him if he's correct that he broke the lock and some of the camera equipment on site of the dog shelter, and he confirms. You could really tell from his passionate account of the progression of the evening that he did all of this out of pure love, as his dog, according to him, was the only thing that pulled him through all of his rough patches with his girlfriend and his substance problem. So the judge orders camera footage to be shown to confirm that it is the suspect, and he confirms. On it, he is seen stumbling about and wrenching one of the dog enclosures open and hugging a German Shepherd. At this point, everyone is touched by seeing this guy be so emotional on the camera footage with the dog, hugging it, petting it, and playing with it. And you can see the judge really get into it as well. Anyway, so this guy continues with his story and tells about how he took the dog to his car and went home never feeling happier in his life. And he ends his account with the driest delivery of, needless to say, I was surprised when I woke up the next day and there was a German Shepherd in my room instead of a Staffordshire Terrier. Everyone just broke out in laughter. He didn't get what was funny. Turns out the dude stole the wrong dog. Judge sentenced him to 50 hours of community service and 3,000 euros or so repairs for the broken doors and camera equipment. And if you ever decide you want to be a world-famous comedian, all you need to do is steal the court records of that man and just recite them out loud. Story 2. Oh geez, where do I start? I mean, I could tell plenty of these about my own clients, but I like this one. A lady has an injury/comp case. It's for her upper back and, of course, complex regional pain syndrome. She decides she needs the insurance company to pay for a special mattress for her, like a $6,000 memory foam mattress with heat and massage and 1,000 other features. And not just a twin, she needs a California king because, of course, her layabout unemployed boyfriend needs to sleep there too. We spend months litigating this damn thing. Finally, she buys it herself, and my client agrees to give her $1,500 just to be done with it. The judge takes myself and opposing counsel aside and says he's going to mess with us if we ever say the word mattress in his court again after wasting all this time. It was that ridiculous. Now 3 months go by and the case comes on for another hearing. After exhausting all the chiropractic care allowed under the law, her doctor was seeking a variance to get some additional chiropractic. We get to court and I'm arguing it should be denied, etc. Judge turns to her and says, "Ma'am, why do you feel you need more chiropractic care?" She pauses for a minute, then says, "I'm having a lot of trouble sleeping on my mattress. I think I saw smoke coming out of his ears." Story 3. Girlfriend is a Reddit lurker, posting on her behalf. This is a story that my grandpa always tells, so some of the details are fuzzy, but this is the gist of it. My grandpa was a public defender, and this was a defense he used for one of his clients who was being accused of attempting to break into a car. How it happened: man number 1 is sitting in his house, and he looks out the window and sees man number 2 next to a car parked in the street. Man number 2 is out there fiddling with the car door for like 10 minutes, and so man number 1 realizes he's trying to break into the car and calls the cops. Man number 2 runs, and eventually man number 3, my grandpa's client, is picked up nearby because he matched the description of man number 2. So my grandpa is meeting with his client and telling him what he's accused of. Client asks, "Wait, what kind of car was it?" Grandpa tells him. Client says, "I can prove that it wasn't me." Grandpa, "How?" Client, "You said the guy was out there for like 10 minutes. I can break into that car in less than 20 seconds. Grandpa, "Prove it." So he finds one of whatever kind of car it was, and the client proceeds to pick the lock in 12 seconds. Grandpa gets the judge out there, and the client does it again for the judge, who makes him do it one more time and then dismisses the case. Story 4. Several years ago, I was doing a civil trial, personal injury, defending a woman who allegedly hit a bus matron with her car. We had offered to concede liability and just try damages. In other words, the jury wouldn't hear the circumstances of how the injury happened, just that we agreed my client caused the injury and they would only decide the amount of damages. We had evidence that the plaintiff was significantly exaggerating her injuries. The plaintiff's attorney refused to agree to our concession, thinking that if the jury heard the circumstances, they'd want to give even more money to punish my client. So we went to trial on liability. The plaintiff called one witness, her client, who testified that an older woman in a green car hit her. They arrested and I moved for dismissal for failure to prove a case. There was literally no evidence connecting my client to this incident, just an older woman in a green car. The plaintiff never bothered to call my client to the stand. The attorney told the judge that the bus driver had written down my client's license plate and gave it to the police. They never bothered trying to find the bus driver. The attorney asked if she could just put the police report in, and I objected that it was hearsay. The attorney then actually said, "Please, just let me just put this in. I haven't had work in a while, and I got retained by a firm to try this case. I really need to win this." Of course, I didn't agree, and the judge dismissed the case. I felt a little bad for her, but that was maybe the worst presentation of a case I ever saw. I spoke with the jury afterwards, and they all said they hated the plaintiff, didn't believe a word she said, and likely would have found in my favor anyway. Moral of the story, be prepared in court. Yep, a novel legal strategy that's sure to impress judges everywhere. Story 5. Prosecutor here had a case where a man mistreated his daughter because she wore suggestive clothing and seemed to be asking for it. He tried to argue that, girls are just active at a younger age now. I remember thinking, what would Dexter do? Anyway, the man got convicted and is now serving 2 life sentences plus 100 years. The reason for that sentence is that he will not be eligible for parole. In my jurisdiction, you're eligible for parole on a life sentence after 30 years. Life and life without parole are 2 different sentences. Here, he was not eligible for life without parole. So in theory, at least, yes, he could serve 2 consecutive life sentences, which would be 60 years, and then parole. Now, however, we are certain he never draws another breath as a free man. I've done several of these cases, and to me, they're much harder than other cases because of the pressure. In this case, the man had no other complaints than this as a father, so if I lose, the poor girl goes back to the dad. Story 6. This came in a deposition, but it's still one of my funniest stories from this old job. I worked part-time as a paralegal when I was in college. We had this massive case with a lot of people involved that had spun out into a bunch of little side cases. In one of those side cases, this guy was claiming our client had left him threatening voicemails related to the main case, and he and his wife sued for loss of consortium. Loss of consortium, and I swear to you this is a real thing, basically means something happened that is stopping a married couple from having intimacy, and they want to sue you over it. The guy was claiming that he was so scared from these voicemails that he couldn't sleep with his wife anymore. Deposition time rolls around and I'm sitting in the other room, but it's a small office and I can hear everything. My boss starts asking the wife how we're supposed to know that it was our client's fault they stopped having intimacy. Maybe she's just not as attracted to him anymore. Maybe he's not attracted to her. Maybe they didn't have that much of an intimate life to begin with, etc. So this woman starts yelling, "I love it," and banging her fists on the table. Her lawyers try to calm her down and tell her to stop talking, but she keeps on shouting, "I love it. We used to have it 2-3 times a day. We'd be thrown out of hotels because of the noise we'd make." And to the protest of everyone in the room, her counsel, and ours, she proceeded to describe their history in detail, all of which was recorded in the deposition and filed with the court. Story 7. Actual lawyer, what I dub the quote-unquote surprise party defense. In a hearing for an order of protection in which the ex-wife is trying to get an order of protection against ex-husband who had been stalking her, they have a high school-aged child together. Her ex-husband tries to argue against the order of protection by saying they may need to be able to communicate about the child. The judge points out that they can communicate through the child, and also that other family members have been put in place by the juvenile court to be intermediaries regarding pickup, drop-off, etc. Then ex-husband has a brilliant light bulb idea. "Judge, what if I need to throw my son a surprise party and I need to keep it a secret from everyone, but his mom still needs to know so she doesn't throw a party at the same day?" In other words, while I admit I have been stalking my ex-wife and that there are grounds to grant an order of protection, you should not grant that order just in case I need to throw a surprise party one day. What made it was how clever he thought the argument was. Thus was born the surprise party defense. A lot of you are upset about the comment of communicating through the child. That was probably a poor way to phrase it. In this situation, the father would be barred from passing messages to the mother through the child. He can't say, "Tell your mom X." But of course, some indirect communication is going to occur, and that is what the judge was referring to. In other words, the father cannot argue that he needs to be able to have direct communication with the mother for purposes of coordinating childcare, things like that, which is often the issue. Because the child in this case is old enough to tell both parents, for example, about school, friends, trips, grades, etc., it is not as if the judge ordered the child to be the intermediary. That's ridiculous. Also, I sort of simplified the complexities of it because these people's parental arrangement was not the point. The dumbness of the argument was the point. But this is a criminal judge determining an order of protection. There is a whole separate juvenile family court judge that actually determines the custody arrangement and things of that nature. The bottom line is the guy was trying to use the kid as an excuse to avoid an order of protection so he could continue to stalk and pester his ex-wife. Story 8. I'm a prosecutor now, but I used to have a private practice where I did a lot of evictions. My usual landlord clients wouldn't even come into my office until their tenants had been behind for months, and most of the time the tenants were defiant in their non-payment, so it wasn't difficult to not take pity on them. Anyway, one tenant was a particularly dumb guy. He usually came to court dressed in cut-off jeans. We had a trial date set, and my client and I showed up. Tenant did not. At the last second before the judge entered a default, some woman comes bursting into the courtroom and yells, "Daryl's on the phone!" The judge allows her to bring the phone up and we put tenant on speaker. He proceeds to ask the judge to delay the trial for 1 week because my brother got his head knocked inside out and is probably gonna pass away. I didn't buy it, but my client knew Daryl well enough to sense the stress and fear in his voice. I told the judge that we would allow the continuance, but only until the next available court day. The judge set it for 1 week out. I still didn't believe Daryl until that night my grandfather was in an accident and we had to rush to the hospital. As we're walking up the hallway, I see Daryl in a room with a bunch of people who dressed like him enough to obviously be family. When we get to my grandpa's room, he ended up not being as seriously injured as we originally feared. The first things he says is, "You'll never guess what happened to the guy down the hall. Nurse told me his idiot brother dropped a tractor bucket on his head. He's in a coma now." I relayed the news to my client, and she felt sorry enough for Daryl that we signed an agreement stating that he would clear out within 15 days and we would forgive all back rent owed. Story 9. Not a lawyer, but I do have a story for this. This happened while I was working as a medical assistant. One of our diabetic patients got a speeding ticket while his glucose was low, and he seemed to be under the impression that this would be an ironclad excuse to get him out of it. So he calls our office one day and I answer. PT will be the patient. Me, Dr. X's office, not his name if that wasn't obvious. The Dark Waffle speaking. How may I help you? PT. Hello, TDW. I need the doctor to write a letter for me. Me. I can definitely help with that. We do this frequently, usually for a jury duty excuse or a note stating that they need to bring their medications with them when they travel, etc. What is the letter for? PT. I got a speeding ticket last weekend and I'm going to contest it. I need a letter from the doctor stating that I have diabetes and that it impairs my ability to drive. So it wasn't my fault I was speeding. Me, ... Me, let me run through this with you just so I'm clear what you're asking for. PT, okay. Me, you want a letter stating you have diabetes. PT, yes. Me, and you wanted to say your diabetes impairs your ability to drive. PT, yeah. Me, and you believe telling the judge that your diabetes impairs your ability to drive will get him to throw out the ticket. PT, yes. Me, I don't think that's a good idea, sir. PT, what? Why? Me, even if they agree with your argument and toss out the ticket, which I doubt they will, if you tell them that you have a medical condition that impairs your driving ability, I'm pretty sure they'll take your license away. PT, no, see, I'm only impaired when my sugar is low. Me, right, but, and this would go on for a few minutes before I told him I'd ask the doctor and see what he thinks. Unsurprisingly, the doctor agreed with me and said he would lose his license if he did that. So we didn't write the letter, but he still brought this argument to traffic court. The patient is now driven to his appointments by his family members. Yeah, sometimes it's best to just take the ticket and just move on with the rest of your life. Let it go. Let it go. Story 10. I wasn't a lawyer, but a law clerk working with the prosecutor's office. This guy was caught on the highest quality security camera video I've ever seen, hurting a store clerk like 15 times. She survived, and then was tackled a block away from the scene not 5 minutes later by a man who had seen him flee and followed him 25 feet from the weapon and the jacket he'd been wearing that he was covered with a receipt with his name on it in the pocket. It was the literal definition of a slam dunk case. The guy chose to proceed to trial without his lawyer. instead of having the case postponed after his attorney's house was broken into and all his files were stolen. This guy's main argument was that it wasn't him because in the statement of probable cause written by the officers after the incident, they misspelled his highly unique last name by adding a T in the middle. For example, Johnson became Johnston. He spelled his name out at every opportunity with much emphasis. He also argued it couldn't be him because the man on the video tied a T-shirt around his head so that the distinctive tattoos there would be hidden, but he would never cover over his tattoos like that because he was proud of them and they represented his heritage as a Korean man. The jury took less than a half hour to return a guilty verdict. Story 11. I'm a lawyer. The most ridiculous argument I've seen was one I actually made. One of my clients got busted cooking substances. This was a very clear-cut case. They actually caught him in the middle of a cook. No way he was getting out of this one. Even worse, he was cooking at home and children were there. Yep, the DA loaded him up with felonies. There was no bail and he was going to be held in the county jail. My client knew he was doomed. He'd been planning to get married a few weeks after he got busted. My client asks me if he can get released for 24 hours so he can still get married. I tell him that I'll ask, but there's no way in hell they'll let him out. First, I asked the DA if they will allow it. Nope, they laughed. So I filed a motion with the court. Now, I knew the judge was a crusty old conservative family values kind of guy. There was no law involved, but I put together an argument about the sanctity of marriage and how the state should encourage marriage at all times and that sort of thing. We have a hearing and I make the argument. The DA is totally opposed and calls it ridiculous. And then the judge grants it. The judge actually decided to allow my client out for 24 hours to get married. He had to surrender at the county jail at 8 a.m. the next day and some other conditions, but still, he was allowed out. Everyone is stunned. Nobody can believe it. The day of the wedding comes, my client gets out, gets married, then goes back to jail. Everything went exactly like how it was supposed to, which is also pretty shocking. Story 12. Public defender checking in. Apart from the usual sociopaths who argue that there's nothing wrong with cheating people, stealing, and screwing people over, and apart from the constitutionalists who want me to argue that because they put their hands over their eyes, the government can't see them anymore, there are some good stories. I had a client accused of a hit-and-run damage to unattended property, to wit, a stop sign post. My client had parked his car in front of a gas pump and walked into a Quickie Mart. The car rolled away from the pump without him, rolled over the curb and then over a stop sign and into a ditch. My client ran out of the store, got in the car, and promptly sped off. His driver's license was also suspended at the moment. This was all captured on video by a conveniently timed passing city bus. My guy wants me to argue that it wasn't hit and run because he wasn't driving the car when the thing got hit. He's got exactly half a point. I had to tell him that his argument solved, at most, half of the problem because it sure as hell was him driving for the run part of the hit and run. He took the plea deal. Story 13. Long-time lurker, but I couldn't resist this one. Not a lawyer, but I was called as a witness to testify for the state regarding an accident that I was involved in. I was hit from behind by a large construction dump truck while sitting at a red light behind another vehicle. It was a 4-lane roadway that merged into 2 after the light, and I was in the right lane heading north. The light turned green, and I hadn't moved yet because I felt the vehicle tap mine. Next thing I know, I'm moving forward, and I begin to panic that something's wrong with my car. Well, apparently, the driver of the dump truck didn't realize he'd hit me and pushed me straight through the intersection, and my car ended up doing a 180 and I was facing south, heading towards a very deep ditch. I was blaring my horn and hitting my brakes and trying to avoid going in the ditch because my son was not even 1 month old at the time and in the back seat along with my dog. I managed to pull the parking brake and we slide to a stop just at the edge of the road before the ditch. Husband turns and asks, "Do I need to call 911?" I tell him no because I see the dump truck pull over to the side a bit north of me and I figure he'll come out to exchange insurance. Lo and behold, the driver took off after about 15 seconds of sitting there. I was stunned but immediately told hubby to then call 911 that we'd be in a hit and run. Sheriff comes, people from the company that hit us come, witnesses who saw the whole thing tell the sheriff what happened and the company apologizes. They start looking for the driver through the GPS on the vehicle. Company ended up paying $2,000 in damage to my car and paid for a brand new car seat. Pictures were taken by all parties as well of the damage present to my car. So imagine my surprise when I got subpoenaed to appear in court to testify against this guy. I can't believe the nerve of this guy that hit me, ran and had the guts to testify not guilty to the charge. The day comes and I show up in court, give my testimony, witnesses give theirs, sheriff gives his. A bit of banter back and forth about a surveillance video from a gas station that the driver obtained but his lawyer didn't bother to enter into evidence before the trial. Judge won't allow her to show the video because the state hasn't had time to review it. We finally got to hear the driver's testimony, and he gave the best excuse that could be summed up like this. I didn't see her car as I was pulling up to the light. I was giving enough distance to stop to the car in front of her, but I didn't see her. I didn't hear the horn blaring because I was in a diesel vehicle and didn't realize that I'd hit her or that I was even involved in an accident, and that's why I didn't stop. I've been having brake issues and I thought it was just my brakes acting up. He apparently thought that he could win his case by testifying that because he didn't see me and realized he wasn't in an accident, he shouldn't be charged with the accident and failure to remain at the scene of the accident. Sorry, ignorance of events doesn't make you any less liable in the eyes of the law. Judge pronounced him guilty and the guy rolled his eyes like he couldn't believe it. I'm still waiting to find out if he tries to appeal it. And if you're enjoying the video so far, please don't forget to hit that subscribe and like button for more videos just like this. Story 14. Thing is, citizen's arrest is largely an urban legend. Outside of very narrow circumstances, you can't detain people. If they commit a crime and run away, call the police. Loss prevention personnel, not just random managers who assume they have a loss prevention duty with proper training, well, that's a different story. But I'm pretty sure in most jurisdictions it was not legal for you to restrict the girl's movement by standing behind her car like that. Of course, it's also illegal for her to deliberately clip you. You were both wrong. But in cases like that, especially when injuries are minor, it's usually just not worth anyone's time to screw with it. While that runs counter to Reddit's +1 justice of constant vigilance, that's just the way it is. For example, the injuries were minor, Your Honor, shouldn't be allowed as a mitigating circumstance because the person breaking the law couldn't know how things would fall out. Nonetheless, it is used all the time. An intoxicated driver who totaled my car and injured me used it in his own defense and got a light sentence even though his BAC was over 0.3, and he fled the scene of the accident he caused. That's just life. Story 15. When I was clerking for a judge in my first year as a lawyer, we had a case that centered around if a person could lawfully harm a dog that is attacking his chickens. The law said that he could harm him if the dogs were bothering or wounding the chickens. Plaintiff was suing for the value of his dogs that were ended and emotional distress. His argument was that the dogs were not bothering or wounding the chickens because they were running away when the farmer came outside with the weapon. He then argues that wounding has to be active, so he gave an example. If the dog has a chicken in his mouth, you can. If he drops it but the chicken is floundering right in front of him, you cannot as the wounding has ended. Pick it back up, lightly pause at it, not wounded. It was ridiculous and inconsistent with case law. I wrote the opinion awarding defendant summary judgment. Here comes my favorite part. Plaintiff asks for a reconsideration based on a single word I used in a throwaway line in the 8-page opinion. I said it was reasonable to assume that the dogs were still a danger to the chickens. During the reconsideration, the partner from the firm comes for plaintiff instead of Joe Schmo and says, Frankly, Judge, I've always thought you were the finest attorney in the region, so I'm shocked you got this so wrong. It's baffling to me. Judge didn't react, but I was plenty offended on his behalf. So I am tasked with writing the reconsideration opinion. I wrote a 2-page summary of the hearing with no indication on the 2 pages which way we were leaning, then pasted the original 8 pages, but with a sentence about reasonableness omitted. I wish I could have watched that lawyer read 3 pages deep to realize it was the exact same decision as before. Story 16. Not a lawyer, but I testify in criminal court regularly due to my job. Anyway, one morning I was sitting in a misdemeanor courtroom and watched a well-dressed, mid-30s Polish lady step up when her name was called. She was charged with the crime of failure to pay bus fare, about $2. Instead of just paying the minimal fine, she went full hard and decided to defend herself pro se against this clearly heinous charge. She then proceeded to give a 45-minute oral argument that stretched my understanding of reality. At various points in this impassioned speech, she dropped to her knees and prayed, invoked the archangel Michael, and began flapping her arms like wings. The judge was not amused and sat there listening with his head in his hands, but he couldn't stop her, of course. Eventually, she finished, and he immediately found her guilty and ordered her to pay something like $40 to the clerk. This only made her angrier, and she began the whole flapping of the arms thing again and arguing with the judge. At this point, the judge explicitly stated, I want you to leave the courtroom now. If you make one single noise on your way out, the deputies will arrest you for contempt. 2 deputies started inching closer to her. They never get much action working courthouse duty, so they were excited. She looked defeated and began to exit, but just at the door, she turned around and opened her stupid mouth once more to call the judge a cursed demon. Everyone applauded as she was dragged out in cuffs. Story 17. Defendant wanted to take back his guilty plea, arguing that the only reason he pleaded guilty was because he had to take a huge mess at the time, but didn't want to do so at the courthouse. Another defendant argued that he was denied the effective assistance of counsel because his defense counsel permitted him to plead guilty to a DUI 20 years ago after the guy crashed his car into a wall and was hammered at 5 a.m. in January. His defense was that he crashed his car, then in the 30 minutes to 1 hour waiting for the police, walked in the freezing cold to a store and drank a whole bottle of whiskey, and so he wasn't technically driving while intoxicated, but became intoxicated afterwards. The judge described the guy as either highly courageous or highly foolhardy for offering that story. Differing defendants claimed his guilty plea was not knowing, intelligent, and voluntary, and therefore invalid, because he was spiked when he came into the courthouse at 9 a.m. I've responded to countless motions from defendants who've said that they didn't know they'd be deported if they plead guilty, even though the judge explicitly told them exactly that. One defendant claimed that he couldn't have committed the robbery by climbing through the bathroom window because he has arthritis and knee and hip problems. He testified to this despite knowing that we had security footage of him climbing in through a window of a church, also to rob it, then jumping up and climbing out, and despite knowing that the judge was going to allow us to show it to the jury if defendant opened the door to such evidence. Non-citizen defendant, who's a level 3 highest offender, argued that his designation should be lowered or removed because he was deported and therefore he doesn't present a danger to the community anymore. Story 18. I was a state witness in parental neglect trial. As an LCSW, I worked for a mental health substance misuse hospital, evaluating children and teens for admission. The state was asking to have the kid removed from the home, in part due to information I reported as I had interviewed and admitted the kid on 3 separate occasions. During one eval, the mother shows up so high she can barely talk. The kid admits he gets all his substances from her. The other evidence comes from info gathering during the kid's inpatient stays. So this is a very rural area with only 2 hospitals in the entire state. As such, I didn't work in the hospital, nor was I part of the inpatient staff. I lived 3 hours west of it, covering the 22 counties on the west side of the state. The prosecution had sworn statements and records from the inpatient staff and called me because I lived in the jurisdiction of this court and could testify in person. So all of this information was introduced the minute I took the stand. The defense lawyer basically repeats all of this and then proceeds to try to get me to support his defense that the inpatient treatment was inadequate. How this relates to the mother giving the kid substances, no one ever figured out. He has absolutely no witnesses of his own, no character references, no other hospital staff, nothing but the state's evidence and me. He repeatedly asks if I agree with his statements that X occurred in treatment or that if Y would have been a better option. After like the 6th time of me stating I was not able to answer the question, the judge cuts him off and asks if he has any other line of questioning. The mother whispers in his ear and he says, yes, he has one more question. Do I think the mother is a fit parent? I was stunned. I looked at everyone and asked him, are you asking me in my professional capacity if I think the mother is fit to parent? I see the state just kind of smiling and shaking his head. The defense is certain and says that's what he's asking. I look at the judge, who smiles and nods at me to answer, so I say, no, in my professional opinion, she is not currently fit to parent. Everyone else is trying not to laugh, but the defense looks so disappointed I almost felt sad for him. I don't know what they were thinking, but needless to say, the state won. Story 19. I'm a little late on this one, and I'm not a lawyer, but was involved in recording proceedings of a case. The case was a major fraud case. There were multiple organizations involved and a lady defrauding them through bad checks. She also had the IRS on her since she would use the receipt she got for the bad checks from charities to add deductions to her tax bill. I don't remember the exact amount of the money taken, but I remember it being something astronomical that made me surprised she hadn't been busted well before then. She was writing checks that she didn't have the funds to cover to charities. She would also write checks to herself, deposit it, and banks typically allow you to recover part of the check, typically $200 to $300, until it's fully processed and goes through, and she would pull that money out of the ATM and use it for whatever. So there was a massive case built up against this lady by the state and these organizations, and she was facing several years in jail, and instead of pleading the 5th, she took the stand, and her defense was that since she was able to withdraw those amounts, it's the bank's fault the money is missing and not hers for the stolen withdrawals. She also tried placing blame on the charities for her IRS scam since they gave her a receipt to use. Total lack of remorse or responsibility about misuse of her checkbook to defraud organizations. Her defense lawyer managed to get the case dragged out over months, and that guy must have somehow been getting paid to delay the trial as much as he did to keep her out of jail. Story 20. Not a lawyer, but served on a jury where the guy had been pulled over and led police on a high-speed chase to his house where a major grow and distribution operation was going on in the basement. The whole thing was captured on HD cruiser and body cams. I'm surprised it went to trial. Anyway, we watched both the body cams and cruiser cam vids. It was broad daylight. We saw everything. The defendant and his lawyer argued it wasn't him driving the car. It was his friend who jumped out of the car and then ran through the backyard away from police. He also argued that he was in the basement bathroom doing his daily number 2 the whole time when police just busted in and arrested him for no reason. It got cringy when we got to the grow distribution part. He and his lawyer argued it wasn't his house. Well, why is that ridiculous? The entire time he is on the stand, his lawyer never should have put him up there. He would say things like, my friend borrowing my car pulled into that driveway where I was staying. The police had mail addressed to him at that address. He again would say stuff like, I had my mail forwarded to my baby mama's house while I was away. That's not my name on the assessor's tax bill, but my friend who has the same exact name and somehow they got the SSN mixed up so it looks like it's addressed to me. Just kept on incriminating himself the whole time. It was bad. We found him guilty on 8 of 9 counts. Story 21. Am a lawyer and am probably cheating. Most ridiculous argument came from a pro se defendant in an eviction proceeding. Our firm represented the landlord because our firm always represented that landlord, and we don't usually have to take things up to court, and when we do, the defendants don't usually show up. The defendant was being evicted for discharging a weapon inside her apartment at about 3 a.m., the bullet of which passed into the apartment of her downstairs neighbor. She had also broken into another neighbor's apartment late at night, broken the glass on the door and let herself in and terrorized a guy, but for whatever reason, he didn't want to come testify in court. Everyone was well aware that she was mentally ill. No one gets evicted for being mentally ill. So we all just tried really hard to focus on the plain facts and not bring up anything that made the defendant look crazy. She did it for us. She testified to the court that she was an alien prisoner, had been all my life, and that the night in question was the anniversary of the night she had been taken by reptilians. She had been wandering around the house, brandishing her weapon for self-defense, and she had heard a noise. She even pulled the trigger, she said. But, she said, the weapon did not fire. Our testimony had included the police officer who identified bullet holes in the floor of her place, the ceiling of her neighbor, the sofa of her neighbor, and the floor of her neighbor. She asked if we were familiar with the concept of quantum tunneling. Yes, she had been brandishing a loaded weapon in her apartment, and yes, she had pulled the trigger, and yes, there may have been bullet holes. She disputed the location of said holes, but she hadn't fired the gun. She also brought as witnesses one of her friends who wasn't sure that aliens existed but was always willing to help the defendant look for them because the defendant was always willing to help her hunt for ghosts at the nearby graveyard. The judge took all the evidence and arguments in, nodded, retired to his chambers, and left us waiting for a really long time. We were worried that the judge might show pity on the defendant because she was unwell. We had made a point that firing a weapon in her apartment, might have ended one of her neighbors and that they had a right to safety in their homes. He finally came out and announced his verdict. He said that he had chosen not to disbelieve any of the testimony and that he found all of the witnesses credible, but then he busted out his Merriam-Webster's dictionary and found one of the possible definitions of discharge and said that while we normally think of discharging a weapon as, firing a weapon, discharge also includes the idea of anything which causes something to come out of it. So, even a quantum tunneling bullet would be a discharge weapon. I thought that this was not a great decision legally because that would also mean that unloading a weapon was discharging it, but this case was never going to see an appeal, and he made an unwell defendant think that they had been heard properly, so it worked out pretty well in practice. Story 22. Not a lawyer, but recently stood witness, victim, in a case where I had been attacked with a weapon. The other guy was my then roommate at university who was 20 to 30 years older than me, also a student. He had been intimidating and threatening to the 3 of us in the flat, shouting, telling us he'd be in prison for smearing food, etc., all over the kitchen and whistling. This came to a head when he told me he would end me and then came at me. He pleaded not guilty. I got called in. I was accused of making this all up because I had been in Doctor Who. I've never been in Doctor Who. He said he had been making an IKEA table in the corridor. Corridors roughly fit 2 people side by side, using the weapon, plus how he'd fit the finished table through the door, and that was why I knew what the blade looked like, seized by police, hidden in his room. They then said I had come up with this with my female roommate and implied I was sleeping with her. She has a girlfriend. I'm a guy, no chance regardless. At the time, I thought I was doomed and he'd get off, but it turns out the court saw through this and charged him, but only with a fine, probably due to his status as a student. Story 23. I got a parking ticket in Virginia once for parking in a no parking zone. In this city, all areas where you can park are outlined by a large box, no defined lines for each space. If there's no parking zone, the box ends and restarts after that zone. I parked inside of the box, but apparently there were signs up that I just didn't see. Explained all of this to the lower court judge, who said, well, you should have looked at the signs too instead of just the pavement. Later, I'm reading online about the county ordinances, and it actually states my argument is a requirement under the law. The boxes have to end and restart. I go back to the court and appeal the matter. One day before court, I got a UPS envelope with a motion to dismiss from the state because a code section they cite does not give the circuit court authority to hear parking matters. I looked up the code section and it doesn't say that at all. It literally says, any matter not felonious may be appealed to the circuit court. Nothing else. They didn't even read their own code section they cited. I quickly get a friend on the phone who is an attorney. He starts writing right away and then shows up to represent me the following morning. He argued that their motion was stupid because the code section doesn't back up their motion, filed a motion for summary judgment because the county failed to appear and they were the original plaintiff, not the state. The clerk in the DA's office messed up by taking on the appeal instead of giving it to the county attorney, and then filed a motion for sanctions for the ADA, sending me the motion the day before when it should have been sent at least 2 weeks prior, and also scheduled for a motion hearing, when instead they intended to just drop it on me the night before, assuming I was unrepresented and wouldn't know any better. I got out of the parking ticket, but we didn't get the sanctions against the ADA. She cursed out my attorney in the hallway for being a mean lawyer, for him trying to get her roasted for her mistake. And if any of these stories got to you, here's more for you. YouTube thinks you're going to love this. I'll catch you in that video.